Hi, everybody. Thank you. Thank you for being here. It is incredible to see so many of you. I'm still watching this number jump up. I have said this on these types of events in the past, but I will say it again now. There is no shortage of items on your to-do list or things that you could be doing in this hour. So we are so grateful that you have chosen to spend this 60 minutes with us. My name is Steve App, and I'm the AVP of Marketing and Business Development here at Simpson Scarborough. And we are here today to share the first chapter of our 2023-2024 CMO study with you, covering budgets and staffing data. For those of you who have attended previous presentations surrounding our CMO study, this is our fifth such presentation going back to 2014. You may notice a few changes in delivery this year. One thing that has not changed, feel free to keep using the chat function. If you have a question that you want answered by our team, do use the Q&A feature within Zoom. We've been doing this for years. You all know the drill and how to make sure your questions get answered, so we can't wait to hear from you. First change you're going to notice this year, we are releasing this year's data in 4 chapters, rather than trying to cram every angle of this study into a single 60-minute session. So today we're covering budgets and staffing, but over the next few months, we are going to be hosting additional webinars covering job satisfaction and efficiency, the role of the website within the CMO portfolio, and marketing measurement. We've also created a new hub for this year's study, which you can visit on our website. This includes overviews of each chapter, links to download full reports, and you can sign up for future webinars or catch recordings of events that you may have missed. But enough about the content that is to come. Let's talk about today. I am joined today by an incredible lineup of colleagues, including Sarah Wallace, Vice President for Strategy, Vanessa Theo-Harris, Associate Vice President of Accounts, and Mari Simpson, our Vice President of Growth. Our Vice President of Research and Analytics and a partner at Simpson Scarborough, Meredith Simpson, is also active in the chat today. We've structured our time together to leave plenty of time for live Q&A, but if you have questions, and you can drop them in the Q&A feature, certain methodology questions in particular, Meredith can answer in a little bit closer to real time. Let's begin with some background on our study this year. First, we are thrilled to see that 268 chief marketing officers completed our study. This figure represents the highest sample size in the history of our CMO study. So to everyone who's on this call and to everyone who's watching this recording in the future, who took the time to provide your information, thank you, thank you, thank you. This year's study also marks the introduction of a few new data points, which we'll be covering in the coming months, including CMO tenure, job satisfaction, as well as the first time that we're able to benchmark the all-important MarTech investment against a previous study. All data in our report comes from 4-year not-for-profit institutions. And one thing that's really exciting in the data this year is that we have been pushing this industry now to embrace senior C-suite marketing leadership for nearly 20 years. And excitingly, this year, we can see that 53% of respondents are in their first CMO equivalent role. And this is not the only change we're seeing. 1/3 of respondents have been in their current role for 1 year or less, and nearly a quarter of our respondents also reported having a new president in their role for less than a year. So while we've been doing this study now for 10 years, there is an unmistakable feeling of newness to this data, which is exciting. Now, unfortunately, you are not going to hear us break down data for certain types of institutions today, such as HBCUs or HSIs. We are not quite at the point where we have the sample size to do that. But you are going to hear us slice the majority of our insights by the institution size. What we have found in previous conversations is that CMOs find this most useful when making comparisons, and then in doing what is so important, which is bringing this data back to their institution to advocate for increased resourcing. So the categories that we've broken down are small institutions being under 3,000 students, medium institutions with between 3,000 and 12,000 students, and large institutions with more than 12,000 students. So when you see these mentioned in our presentation and in the report that you'll get after this webinar, these are the parameters that we're referencing. I just mentioned a wave of new CMOs and what a landscape they are entering. And we are not going to spend a lot of time talking about this piece because we and others have talked ad nauseum about the challenges facing higher education, which are plenty, from low levels of public confidence to shifting demographics and increased competition. But what is more interesting is how higher education has responded to these challenges. Because what we in this meeting all know to be true in our industry would seem to demonstrate the need for near universal growth in marketing investment. But the data in our 2023-24 study indicates otherwise. Higher education is experiencing this great unevening. The chasm between those institutions who are thriving and those who are struggling has never felt so great. And our data, which we're going to speak to in our time together today, indicates that this gap is only likely to increase even further in the years to come. And what is at the center of that chasm? It's campus size. So I'm going to show you 4 data slides here. And if you want to screenshot them, I encourage it. They are in the report that you'll get after this. But this first data point on the total median marketing budget, which is inclusive of all salaries, media, vendor relations, is a good example of what I'm describing. Now, there is good news here. So 37% of CMOs in our study this year reported that their marketing budget had increased in the past year. And that is 6% more than the same number who said that in 2021. And as you can see here, small schools are finally moving the needle since 2019 on budget increases, which is great. But when digging into the data, only 28% of small school respondents actually saw this increase, and a nearly equal amount of small school CMOs actually reported a budget decrease. So while there is undoubtedly some success happening here, we're seeing that a lot of small schools in particular are still finding it really challenging to justify this increase in marketing investment. If we turn our attention to salaries, the picture is generally the same. So we're seeing here that the increases are mostly modest, with the exception of large schools, which see a pretty significant jump in this category. What's interesting, however, is that it appears that the majority of increases in budget are really being spent on additional staff. And we raised this issue in 2022, but it is honestly still relevant today, which is that we need to consider how we are spending our budget. And if we're using our funds to onboard the right skills, and if our focus on in-house staff is still the right move in today's job market. Next, let's look into the budget investment for MarTech. As I mentioned earlier, this is the first year that we have benchmarking comparison for MarTech investment. And surprisingly to us, we saw across all sizes of schools that institutions either stayed the same or actually decreased their investment in MarTech. And generally speaking, these numbers don't really feel like a large enough investment in MarTech. And I think there's also some questions worth asking around if we're set up to maximize the investments that we are making. And it'll be also interesting, at least from my perspective, to see how this continues shifting. We only have the 1 year of benchmarking data. We know artificial intelligence is already playing a massive role in our everyday marketing lives. It will be really interesting right here to see how this number shifts in the next CMO study that we do. Finally, let's look at digital advertising spend. So more than any other category, this is where we see a pretty universal uptick since 2019. Every category of school here has doubled their investment since 2019 at a minimum. And there are 2 points I think worth making here. And on the first one, I want to be completely candid with you. It is great to have this data, but there is a difficulty in collecting this data. And I can see some of this in the chat already, because I imagine some of you who participated in this study also had a hard time providing fully accurate or apples to apples data, because the fact in higher education is that it is in many cases incredibly decentralized and siloed, and that can make gathering this data difficult. To that point, 50% of CMOs in this year's study said that they couldn't estimate the percentage of marketing spend coming from central marketing. The second point is that this gap in spending, the one that you see in this category and the one that you've seen in every category preceding it, regardless of the size school that you personally represent, is concerning. Because you may have noticed in the charts that I just shared that there is a large gap, and one that is only increasing in many cases, between large and small school marketing investments. And small institutions in particular are so often tuition dependent. And with brand and reputation becoming an increasingly influential aspect in prospective student decision-making, we need to remember that students don't change their expectations of your brand based on the size of your campus. And this gap is already playing a role in overall institutional health. And it is the small schools that can least afford a slip in tuition or philanthropic revenue that are seeing exactly that. So compared to their peers at large institutions, CMOs at small institutions were less likely to report increases in undergraduate applications and enrollment, graduate applications and enrollment, and alumni fundraising and engagement. And that is because while campus size does not dictate brand expectations, budget does dictate brand exposure. And small schools in particular need to start adopting a big school mentality when it comes to marketing investment, because treating marketing as a cost savings lever is not working out. Now, this is not to say that CMOs at large schools are thrilled. If there is a universal truth in our data this year, it is this one. CMOs are feeling the strain of leadership expectations and resourcing that feels inadequate to meet those expectations. Only 1 in 4 CMOs say that their institution's investment in marketing is appropriate given the expectations of the marketing department. And an equal amount say that their marketing department has the budget and the staff needed to meet the expectations of leadership. And I want to say that data point, 1 in 4, this is not a new data point for us. So with the time that we have left with you all, I want us to stop talking about the fact that marketing leaders are struggling with inadequate resourcing. And I want us to start the conversation about what we can actually do about it. And we're going to start on that front with maximizing your budgets. And for that, I am going to pass the metaphorical Zoom microphone over to our Vice President of Strategy, Sarah Wallace. Sarah?
Thanks, Steve. So as y'all have just heard and seen in the data that Steve just ran through, institutions are stretched super thin, regardless of size. Beyond this being a time management struggle for teams in-house, like with an average of 15 projects a week, who has time to think about these things? The so what here is really that CMOs are struggling to fill positions, with 55% of you indicating that they're struggling to fill an open position right now, while also racing to stay present for prospects in this digital age. Knowing the volatile environment that institutions are currently operating in, we're going to focus on 3 investment trends that we identified in this year's study. The first trend focuses on more growth in overall team size and a growing priority to bring these key roles in-house. Generally, what we saw is that role priorities across institutions, regardless of size, are consistent. CMOs are focused on building digital, content, and analytics expertise in-house. You can see here on this slide that institutions are really leaning into web positions, SEO, content expertise, and again, campaign reporting, data, and potentially MarTech support. What's interesting when looking at this data is when we compare it to that 55% of CMOs who indicated that they're struggling to fill those positions right now, we can't help but see that connection, that many of these key roles are likely a culprit in that. Our second trend is all about MarTech, mainly the limited investments institutions are making today in both tools and technology. MarTech investment displayed significant variability in investment for large versus small sized institutions in this year's data. Large school CMOs were 4% more likely to report an increase in investment, while small school CMOs were 8% less likely to report an increase in investment. When we look at those data figures against the fact that about 2.5% of total marketing budgets are being invested in MarTech at institutions, that's a flag for us. Regardless of school size, these investments are too small, for small schools in particular. MarTech investments at small schools are the biggest area of opportunity for these institutions to maximize impact while managing and minimizing the resources currently available to them. Finally, we're seeing some interesting trends in overall media investment, paid media in particular, with stats like a 31% decline in traditional media investment piquing our interest. Earlier in our discussion, Steve showcased some of the overall increase in digital media investment, which was great to see between 2021 and 2023. When we dig deeper into the 2023 data, we can see that actually a majority of budgets have remained the same or decreased since 2021. 53% reported that their budget remained the same or decreased in digital media. So it tells us it's likely a cross-section of smaller schools or a small cohort of schools that experienced a really large increase in their budget, and that's resulting in a bump to that overall average. But it's really that traditional media figure that interests us the most. 75% of schools reported budgets have stayed the same or decreased. Of that 75%, 31% reported a decline overall. While it may seem strategic to reduce traditional investments to boost digital presence or reinvest in other areas, traditional media has proven crucial to digital media success and overall marketing success, and can be closely correlated to enrollment and admissions campaign success. So considering all of the internal and external challenges that institutions are facing today, let's talk about 3 strategies for institutions to employ when seeking to maximize impact and minimize lift. The first strategy is what we're calling remaining committed to your core. So what does that mean? Your core comprises of your identity, your connections or your advocates, current or potential, and the cultural and societal norms or trends that influence what we do or why we do it. Keeping these 3 things really closely connected is what leads to successful brand activations. But how do we know that they're successful? Through measurement strategy. Measuring success is super challenging in today's environment. Many of you indicated that you don't feel you have the time or the expertise to do this well. Nebulous placements or strategies like traditional media that we were just talking about are notoriously difficult to measure, and that doesn't help, but it shouldn't deter. This is where the right outside partners compared to in-housing and MarTech investments can make a huge difference for CMOs. Our second strategy is finding the right balance across marketing spend. Adequate investment across brand and performance really proves critical to achieving long-term and short-term goals. Finding the right balance of budgets supports results like a 6% increase in enrollment, a 15% increase in leads generated, both of which Simpson Scarborough has seen in working with partners who leaned into brand marketing before that performance marketing element. What we need to remember is that brand marketing shapes the perceptions of target audiences. We want to remain top of mind during key moments in the student journey, so when a prospect student moves in market, performance marketing converts more efficiently. Our third and final strategy is the old adage that less is more. Instead of spreading your resources too thin across multiple priorities, maximize your reach and scale by focusing on projects closest to your core and keeping those 3 elements that we spoke about a moment ago really closely connected. We understand that likely sounds easy, and we know that it's not. Y'all are juggling multiple internal and external competing priorities, and that requires a ton of energy. Having the right people and teams supporting those efforts makes all the difference. And this is where Vanessa is going to lead our conversation in our next section.
Thanks, Sarah. So that's a perfect segue to dive a bit more into the staffing trends that we've learned this year in this year's study. The study provided us with some critical insights of staffing trends in higher ed, particularly the disparity between small and large campuses, which impact the way that CMOs like yourselves can operate. So Steve mentioned a couple of these stats, but to reiterate and to dive a little bit deeper into what we've seen between large and small schools. So first, focusing on large schools. So CMOs at large institutions reported moderate but consistent gains in staffing this year. So the average staff size grew by 4 positions compared to 2021. So from 29 full-time staff members, the average staff size is now 33. And while this growth isn't significant, it is consistent. So we saw that 88% of large school CMOs did report either an increase or a stable year in terms of the staff size. So if we switch to small schools did also report increased staffing levels. So their gains were modest. So the average team size increased by 2 positions. So from 7 in 2021 to 9 this year. But these gains have been experienced by a minority of these small school CMOs. So only 18% reported an increase in their team size. And in fact, small school CMOs were more likely to report a staffing decrease in the past year. So about 23% reported that decrease rather than an increase. So when I think about this and the other data from the study, and then of course, context that we know from working with dozens of institutions like yourselves, I summarized our takeaways into 2 primary themes related to staffing. So first is the notion of taking charge of your charge. And this certainly starts before you start. I'm going to give a shout out. I saw Julie Reed on the call from the board group. Shout out to you. But one of the things we found really interesting is the responses to the study this year. We saw that more than half of CMOs who participated in the study have been in their role for less than 3 years. And nearly a quarter of CMOs who responded have had a new president within the last year. So there is a lot of change. And of course, we're all feeling the strain of a lot of that change and therefore anticipated growth. So it really starts before you start. When you're evaluating potential opportunities within an organization, you really want to ask a lot of questions to ensure you're set up for success. So we have some listed here on the right. To reiterate them, ask questions like, what are the top priorities for this role? What will success look like? Does this role sit on the cabinet or senior staff? Does it report to the president? How are decisions made at the leadership level? And related to that, who will be the CMO's key cross-functional partners? What is the budget process? What does that financial cycle look like? And how do you make sure you would be part of those conversations? And then, of course, related to some of these stats now, what is the current department structure? What is the history of the structure? And importantly, an important nod to the cultural norms, what are the average tenures of those within the department? So, of course, asking questions like this would align the opportunity to your career goals, but also give you a thorough understanding going in of what your priorities would be. And on a related note, particularly for those of you who are hiring for senior level staff members, these are really important questions to consider when hiring these full-time roles. Prepare answers to these questions prior to the recruitment process, and then look for candidates who are really curious about these topics as well. And similarly, when you're thinking about inspiring your staff and of course yourself, leaders like yourself want to be able to look back at their time and tell stories of achievements and accomplishments, both big and small. And this is regardless of the resources available. So we've talked quite a bit about the growth of the CMO role beyond promotion. And similarly, ultimately, aligning to revenue driving initiatives will put you in the driver's seat and elevate the role of marketing and communications for the organization. And it will well position your work in budget conversations. So really consider what those macro strategic objectives of the institution are that align to things like the strategic plan, of course, as a way to be part of those discussions, those dialogues. And then distilling down further, what are marketing and communications initiatives that will motivate and energize your team? So some of those might not even require significant budget investment, and some of them might be aligned to someone's professional development goals, something they want to do for a really long time, low budget, high impact opportunities too. So really thinking about how you can do that as a leader and offer those opportunities for your staff. And then the second theme is leaner can be meaner. We learned in the survey, and there was a little bit of chat about this here in this webinar so far, that CMOs at small institutions spent 50% of their total budget on salaries. And at the large school level, that's 66%. And so for comparison, for-profit corporations spend only a quarter of their budgets on talent. That is a big difference. So we've been thinking and talking a lot about what that means. And one of the key takeaways here is that, you know, the marketing organizations really have to think critically and stop trying to fill positions that they're not well suited to staff or in particular retain. More than half of all companies outsource at least some of their marketing, with paid advertising, web development, SEO, and content marketing being the most likely skills to be outsourced. Sarah covered this in her talk as well. So something to really think critically about when it comes to what your staff needs to look like in-house or outsourced. So more on that in a little bit, but other ideas related to a leaner staff. First of all, thinking about maximizing your professional development. The study showed us that only 1 in 5 CMOs this year reported an increase in their professional development budget. And actually in small schools, that's only 1 in 10 reported an increase. So really ensuring that the marketing professionals that you deem mission critical to the organization have the tools, software, and educational opportunities that will lead to their own continued growth, excellence in their roles, as well as retention. Secondly, something to consider when it comes to structuring your team staff is considering your own skill sets and experience. What do you love to do? What do you want to continue doing? And use that to balance what your senior staff in particular will bring in terms of expertise and skill set. So in other words, what seat can you sit in and not necessarily hire a senior full-time staff member to counter that, and rather think about hiring your staff to really balance out what your strengths and skill sets are. And then third, again, with the theme of outsourcing, be critical about what expertise needs to be in-house versus what you outsource. Considering a variety of factors, the volume or capacity of the work that would be needed for a full-time role, the talent available in your region, and then of course, you know, the need to be on campus versus hybrid or remote. So really the modality there. And through this, not just considering agencies like our own or firms, but also individuals. So thinking about key partners outside the organization that you could delegate discrete projects or tasks to on a freelance or contract basis. And also should mention to consider what your own internal bandwidth might be to manage those external resources. So what's the right healthy mix of number of agencies, individuals that you'll have to manage or your team will have to manage? So it does allow you to cast a wider net to bring in top expertise in certain areas in a scalable, effective, and financially reasonable way. And so with that, I'm going to pass it over to Murray, who's going to dive into some larger context around the data that we're sharing with you today.
Awesome. Okay, great. Hi, everyone. So our study focused on the US, but being the only Brit at Simpson Scarborough, I've been tasked with giving some global comparisons. So the Higher Education Marketer Survey from Times Higher Education and Net Natives has just closed, and results will be released later this year. And they had over 900 marketers from universities and colleges take part from around the world. So we've managed to get a sneak peek for just our attendees here in the webinar today to give us some of those comparisons. So what I will say, the main comparison is a lot of synergy. It's that everyone around the world says that budget is an issue. It's a challenge everywhere. But the solution, that's where there are huge differences across the pond. So the Europe solution is all around keeping quality staff and measuring and improving brand positioning. And the US solution is all around improving conversion rates and measuring and tracking media ROI. Now, I'm not going to be the guy on the call that tells you Europe's thinking about this better, but I can hopefully give you some context to the European solution. And we really have a theory here. And the people who make up our agency, we've worked with schools all around the world. And when we saw the focus on Europe building up their brands, we really understood why. So the US schools, in our opinion, already think of themselves as brands. And the European schools really want to think of themselves as brands. In the US, we're really ahead. We have so many audiences beyond enrollment that generate significant revenues. We have athletics, fundraising, alumni. And the European institutions are really needing to improve their brand positioning overall to diversify their revenues and survive. So it's no surprise to us that this is their biggest focus. And on the flip side, when it comes to how do we actually measure ROI and how do we increase our spends, the US schools really wish they could track ROI. And we're really behind Europe when it comes to this. And our theory is that European institutions, they went through GDPR compliance back in 2018 and were preparing for it years before. And it's led them to become incredibly robust and have already established first-party data strategies to know what to track, how to track, and where to track. So in terms of solutions, who's going to make the biggest impact? Only time's going to tell. And we'll be keeping a close pulse from our friends around the world on their success in the coming years. But now we wanted to go back to America and more importantly to you, the attendees of this webinar. So when you signed up to this webinar, we asked you what your biggest marketing challenge is. And unsurprisingly, most of the comments were around budget. But when we digged deeper, we found these 4 key themes. The first was to fully connect admissions and marketing teams. We often don't know if we have a lead volume, lead quality, or nurture challenge. And some institutions can spend a lot of time pointing the finger at each other and not enough time focusing on what the real solution is. The second is demonstrating return on spend. We do have some archaic CRMs and higher ed being far behind on attribution. So we're really lagging in progress, and it's only becoming harder with the cookieless world being introduced and attribution being further challenged. Then we have marketing functions being decentralized, which we can see a lot of in the chat now. With so many of us not knowing our budgets outside of Central, it's an issue that's been around for decades. And it's really hard to roll out successful branding and media campaigns when everyone's cross-bidding and duplicating efforts. And finally, like Sarah said earlier, you said you don't track the metrics due to limited expertise and resource. And that's probably why a lot of you are here. So we wanted to give you 3 key takeaways that even faced with limited expertise and resource, you can hopefully take back to your campus to get started on now. So the first of these is to strategize behind the scenes. Now, many CMOs stress the importance of teaching their president why marketing is important. And the language they like is ROI and numbers. Great. So we recommend everyone to take a step back. Think about all the metrics you're gathering and what questions you would love to be able to answer. Things like, what is our cost of acquisition? How is our brand doing versus our competitors? How is our market share trending? These metrics can take years to gather. So starting to ask these questions now is really important before we fall behind. The next is to be your own best advocate. And this means both to the leadership and your friends across marketing that are decentralized. So whether that's getting a view of all of the campaign briefs, brand assets into one place, or having visibility over everything that's external facing. We can't tell you how many of our partners come to us showing us assets and materials that they've never seen and they're already out in the market. So trying to get this centralized by bringing people with you, being that advocate internally, being that support system for your other functions across the university will really provide you a greater strategic direction for the marketing strategy going forward. And finally, curating your Marcom office. Now, your leadership will really appreciate any forward planning here. And we've spoken a lot about staffing in this webinar, but we really do live in a different world now where remote roles are common, AI is streamlining tasks, specialist skills are really hard to find. So, when you're reviewing your in-house and outsourced tasks, think about whether outsourcing specialist tasks is right for you, especially in a market where these roles are really hard to fill. And if you're welcoming new leadership to your institution, get in there early with these recommendations to show that you're forward planning. Now, sometimes an external voice can help move the needle that you've been trying to move for years, which I know can be really frustrating when a vendor comes in and you're like, I've been saying this for years, and you've come in and they're listening to you. So we get it. But we're happy to discuss any case studies we've had success with and also share our own experiences of technologies and strategies that have been implemented successfully. So that wraps up most of the data from the first chapter of the CMO study, and you'll be able to see us dig deeper into the rest of the chapters as follows. So on March 21st, we have the changing role of the higher ed CMO webinar. We're seeing a big shift from a storytelling and promotion role to one that plays a key part on the institutional strategy. So please join us if you want to hear our perspective on what the future CMO looks like. On April 25th, we'll be hosting the State of Higher Ed websites. The website is often our most valuable asset, so we'll be sharing data from the CMO study alongside our perspectives and our POVs to help guide your future strategies in this area. And finally, on May 16th, we'll be hosting a webinar on measurement. I can see there's been a few questions on measurement in the chat. This will include things around brand impact, ROI metrics, and ideas on the data to take to your president beyond just enrollments and rankings. You'll also be receiving a link for the webinar and the full report on email by the end of the day today. So before we go into the Q&A, we also just wanted to let you all know about the release of our CMO Lab event this year in June. So if you enjoyed the contents of this webinar, you liked hearing us talk, you thought we were interesting, brilliant. We're hosting an event so we can do it in person. This will be on June the 11th till the 13th in Pittsburgh. The event is going to focus on enhancing your leadership and management skills, unlocking strategies for improving brand and marketing performance, and those all-important networking opportunities. So we have some really exciting keynote speakers alongside some wonderful panelists from the HE space. So please save the date, and we'll be following up on more details soon. So I think now we're going to open up the Q&A portion of the webinar, and our friend and partner of Simpson Scarborough, Meredith Simpson, has been plugging away in the chat. So thank you, Meredith. She was the brains and mastermind behind the CMO survey. So Meredith, welcome to the chat, and I think we can start to answer some questions.
Awesome. Thanks, Murray. And thank you, Sarah and Vanessa as well, for sharing your perspective on the budgets and staffing data in this year's report, respectively. We have a couple questions here that are in our queue. And again, I know we've encouraged this throughout our session here, but we've intentionally tried to leave as much time as Q&A as possible. So if you still do have questions, feel free to use the Q&A feature to drop these into our session so we can make sure that we're answering them live with you all. I think this first question that I want to address is interesting. I saw a couple questions about it, so I'm going to paraphrase a few to combine them. There's interesting questions around using students in marketing efforts in terms of augmenting staff with student employees. And I'm curious for you, Sarah or Vanessa, in your experience with clients and brand management, what we've seen have been the keys to success with taking that kind of an approach.
I can start. Obviously, I think we've all experienced some rock star student interns, student workers, and especially given the opportunity for a student to be able to build that professional skill set at their institution is great. I think there's two things come to mind that I think are really important to remember. You will have variability of commitment of a student, and it's nothing about them personally, but just where their attention is pulled during their time while in school. It tends to be a challenge. A number of institutions, they say, oh well, it's like an excuse. Oh well, they had an exam or they had this or that other thing that pulled their attention. So that reliability I know can be a challenge. So also knowing that the individual will graduate and leave. So thinking about how much you invest in their own tenure there. So what I have seen worked really well is very discrete assigned projects. So thinking about what is a specific project or initiative. I know some schools that I work with are playing with having them work on it outside of their hours. They can work on it over the weekend, like being flexible about their own time spent. Particularly when it comes to website redesigns, that's a great example of can be very specific, discrete tasks that the student can work on within their own time. So whether it's writing or editing or proofreading, those sort of things are really great. Certainly leveraging students for content creation, social media, and similar type programs are always a huge win. But again, being realistic about the kind of the expectations and being fair, but also very clear about what you're hoping that they can contribute to.
Sarah, I want to go to another question, which I think came up twice here, so I'm going to lump it into one. And this is around marketing spend, specifically to support these three buckets that I think we've talked about in teasing at least a little bit, which is reputation management, enrollment, and advancement. And Sarah, I know you talked a little bit about brand versus performance, but I'm wondering if you can expand a little bit on that to discuss kind of how we should be thinking about divvying up that marketing spend there.
Yeah, it's a great question in large part because brand budgets have suffered pretty significantly in recent years with much more emphasis being placed on performance or enrollment admissions related marketing efforts, which makes complete sense when you're super strained and resources are stretched thin. One of the benefits of brand media beyond buoying or supporting performance media for admissions is that it provides all of that additional support and essentially that umbrella for advancement, athletics, reputation management, with really that last piece, reputation management, being the biggest role or opportunity. Building advocacy regardless of the intended output, whether that is donations, whether that is alumni engagement, whether that is admissions or engaging prospective students in the right ways. Reputation management is your bread and butter. And when we go back to that core identity that I was talking about earlier, that's really that focus in the center is what is our brand identity and how do we talk about that consistently? And that's where there's a lot of opportunity with what Vanessa was just talking about too, the inclusion of student employees, phenomenal opportunity. I agree with her that definitely include them, be very conscious of the reliance, what you are relying on them for, and just be very open and honest about that. But the more they have, or other teams, including advancement, alumni relations, have a core brand strategy to work from, the more successful all teams will be overall.
I also want to know, to add on to that, Sarah, and we're going to cover this in more detail in our second chapter for everyone who's with us today. But one of the things that we saw in our job satisfaction data is that there is a pretty big discrepancy in job satisfaction for CMOs on those relationships that they're cultivating across other areas of the institution, with a lot of CMOs being pretty close with admissions, but then some real varying numbers when we expand beyond enrollment, and advancement certainly falls within that latter camp there. Vanessa, I want to go back to you with this next question because there's an interesting question about separating out CMOs from CCOs or CCMOs and how these blend together, because I know it's rare for an institution to have both of these positions in place. And I think this goes back to something you were saying earlier about really understanding where the sweet spot is for someone's own experience.
I'm laughing because there's someone on this call that I just had a conversation about this earlier today. So shout out to you. I'll keep you anonymous. So for the sake of the study, they are lumped together into one top line. So there's not a difference between CCO or CMO, but we refer to them as CMO to be more broad here. As Steve said, it's so much about the focus of the role and also being really critical and mindful again in the evaluation process of saying, okay, what are the key objectives for this person? How will they be measured? The success of their role equates to what? I do think it also is an important nod to where the institution is in their own trajectory of whether the role does need to focus on communication, strategic communication initiatives versus having a heavy hand in marketing, which is that more traditional partnering with the revenue generating business units. So I do think there is ultimately a difference, and I think what's important in higher ed is we have to recognize that it's not just a title. It does put a nod, especially internally, to what the focus of this unit is at the institution and what the priorities of the institution are. I know there's some folks are even having conversations with their leadership around my title does not have marketing, but I'm being asked, myself and my team are being asked to deliver on marketing activities. We don't have that expertise in-house because we have not been historically positioned in that way. So being fair to yourself and setting those clear boundaries and using it as a way to educate is really important, I think.
Thanks, Vanessa. I'm gonna stick with you, if that's all right.
Okay.
Another question about some of the differences between a full-time employee and then outsourcing for certain functions to show how that can be effective. And I think you talked a little bit about this earlier, but I wonder if you can expand a little bit on some of the things to think about when making that decision, because I think what I'm seeing a lot in our space right now is an acknowledgement that we need more specialized positions within marketing, within higher education. I think the immediate second thought there is that needs to be an in-house, and maybe that's because it feels cost effective. But I think there's some pieces to that we need to be considering, and I know you have some thoughts there.
Yeah, and a big part of this too, and there was someone in the chat had mentioned this too, is when you think about building a new role on your team, you do have to think about what their growth trajectory might be as well. And I do get a little nervous that when sometimes, in order to retain individual as well, you want to find out ways to motivate them. And if we're hiring very, very specific roles that have very specific, like kind of a tactical execution, there was a list that Sarah shared, thinking about what their growth might look like, how they're going to be challenged. And a lot of individuals in those roles, for them, it's bigger projects that might be more complex, that might require more strategic thinking, and they might hit a ceiling within what they have available with you. So I do want to be mindful about that as well. What we are seeing more and more, and there's been a few different examples that we've seen even within our own client base right now, is creation of more senior level strategic roles. So, reporting up to the VP, and perhaps it's one or two AVPs that really oversee different elements of the unit. So perhaps it's simple as comms and marketing. Perhaps it's digital efforts, so all the kind of web and the digital media pieces. And it really it's like a generalist and a specialist in both ways to some extent, where they grew up in the discipline in many ways, and they do have that deep expertise, but they're able to look at it as an integrated function and speak about its place within the larger strategic framework of the department. So I think that when you're able to do that, that your department and your organization is owning that strategy. And then from an execution standpoint, you kind of put all the puzzle pieces together. And part of that might be simply, it makes more sense for us to outsource 20 hours a week or for a particular project to an expert in SEO or an expert in content writing for web, because, it really makes sense to get the best expertise to pull that together, but still have someone in-house owning that strategy.
Great. Thanks, Vanessa. I'm going to do one more question here, as I think we're making good progress here and we're starting to slow down. And I want to talk about metrics here real quick, because this question came in and I think it's really interesting when we talk about ROI, and we did talk a little bit about demonstrating ROI. Can we talk a little bit more about some of the metrics that are going to be the ones that are most influential in some of the conversations that we're trying to bring to leadership? I think, Murray, you mentioned presidents, but also CFOs, other new positions that might be turning over at the highest levels of leadership within our institution. And Murray and Sarah, I feel like you can both speak to the ideas of what some of these metrics are we need to be thinking about.
Yeah, absolutely. I can kick off. I think from our experience working with VPs, CMOs, CFOs, that they're always wanting that cost of acquisition metric, and it can really be quite challenging to get that. If we were just look at media and just look at cost per lead, cost per app, cost per enrollment, it tends to follow a bit of a linear path, right? It's that last click attribution piece, and that's what institutions need to be able to do just as a minimum, but it's not a exact science, right? We could say it was $10,000 to recruit a student from Google, great, but that's not always the case. That doesn't take into consideration your brand power, how much your brand awareness impacts that metric. So really it's all about working in an ecosystem. So I would say it's twofold. One is measuring acquisition from your leads through to enrollments with that media data and your CRMs, whether that's Slate or MS Dynamics or Salesforce or whichever one it is that you're using. But the other part of that is also measuring your brand and the strength of your brand and how much that's impacting your bottom line. And I think we'll probably cover that more in our measurement chapter, which I think was chapter 4. So the last one, great. But I think we'll cover that a bit more in detail there, hopefully with some methodologies and times in which that's been really effective for us and what we've seen in the market.
Sarah, anything you want to add there in terms of larger picture metrics and then digging down deeper?
Yeah, I think Murray's right on the money. I completely agree. It is finding the balance between low funnel metrics like cost per enrollment or cost per acquisition and that brand equity piece, which is in part why that May webinar is so exciting, with the opportunity to dig in even further and understand how we define brand equity, what elements or metrics go into that, and the benefit that those metrics provide to multiple areas or spaces within the institution, enrollment and admissions being one of those spaces. I will add too that this is where there's this critical piece of MarTech that we were talking about earlier, with a smaller percent of Marcom budgets going into MarTech, and also understanding that other areas of the institution are likely investing in it as well. That's a clear indicator of to us as a space where if we can amplify the right digital tools and the right partnerships, we'll be able to build stronger baselines at institutions on how we're defining what an enrollment is, what is acquisition, to Murray's point, and start to really pair up for the long term how that relates back to things like brand health, perception, awareness, familiarity.
Excellent, excellent. I know we're coming right up on the hour. I hope we got to all of these questions. I did try to combine a few of them as they were coming in because they were really similar in topic. And like I said, we have 3 more chapters to come, as well as an in-person event coming in June. So there will be a lot of opportunity to continue this conversation. And we do hope to continue this conversation with you all. At an individual level, this is one of my favorite studies that we do, and it always leads to some really rich, incredible conversations. So to everyone who made time to spend with us live today, thank you for doing that. If you're watching this recording in the future, thank you for watching the webinar recording. Not everybody watches the webinar recording. Thank you for serving higher education. It is a societal good and you are special for doing it. Thank you for being here with us. Until next time, keep on keeping on. Thanks, everybody.